This time on KEI Fabrication. Okay, so folks, what I'm doing here by this Crown Victoria is I am going to take the front spindles off. The idea is either to be able to adapt these spindles to the Mazda B2200 ball joints or control arms, or I might be able to just take the spindle hub assembly, the wheel bearing assembly, maybe make some shims to go between the Mazda spindle shaft and the ID of these bearings. So the best way to do that is grab a set and see if you can make it work. So here we go. So this one's really sitting in the dirt. The only place I could get a jack is way under the back. I found a tire to shove under the middle. Hopefully that'll pivot and give me room to jack up the front. Alright folks, so what I've done is I've just stripped the spindle down to get rid of the caliper and the rotor, and what I'm trying to do is see if this wheel bearing assembly off the 96 Crown Victoria that I got out of the junkyard, can I adapt it to this spindle? And I've test fitted it once. The good news is that it fits all the way on. The only thing I'll have to do is create a spacer. It's going to be a bushing to go between the ID of the factory Mazda race to the ID of the factory Crown Vic bearing. That's not a problem. The only problem I'm going to have is the outer bearing rides back here on this taper. So this is something that I don't have the capability to machine myself, but I'm going to have to send it out to a machine shop that has interpolation capabilities, and I'll have them machine that taper in, so I'll have a good bearing surface so it'll be an all-inclusive spacer with the right taper to come all the way out. The good news is I think it is a viable option to get the big disc brakes on here. So let me I'm using the outer wheel bearing here as a spacer so I get rid of some of this wobble, because I'm just taking this apart temporarily because I've got to drive this truck in a couple hours. So I think the other thing that'll be capable of doing is using the factory Mazda spindle nut to apply the torque to the spacer, and the required torque for this type of bearing. Obviously the tapered roller bearing does not require a torque spec, but this inner and outer type bearing for the Crown Vic spindle hub actually requires a fair amount of torque. I think it's 138 foot-pounds. So here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to put the rotor on just so we can get a comparison. This is the Mazda rotor, and this is the Crown Vic rotor. Now I've got the rotor out of the junkyard for the Crown Vic, but it is probably 5/8 of an inch bigger in diameter, and the brake bearing surface area is far larger than the stock Mazda one. So there's a great amount of braking capacity to be gained by this. And these parts are all dirt cheap. They're high volume parts in the parts store, and I think they're going to work really well. So I'm just going to zip this up. My next big test is going to be, does the caliper bracket come anywhere near fitting the rotor, and we'll take a look at that next. So I'm just checking something out of curiosity. This is a giant tire. It's a 255/70/16. I'm going to be running a much lower profile, but the thing is almost 11 inches wide from bulge to bulge, so it's a great, with this large diameter, with the way the hub is set up, I wanted to make sure a couple of things. First of all, how far outside of the truck is it going to stick? And the second thing is, when I turn it full lock left and right, does it rub? And the good news is I can get full lock out of it with this giant diameter tire on there. So when I get down to a small profile tire, I haven't decided what I'm going to run yet, but something short, obviously, 60 or 65 series. It's an 8-inch wide rim. I'd like to maintain using it. Like I said, it's similar looking to the Mazda wheel, especially if it's painted white. However, I might be able to get by with the sleeper look by having a slightly shiny rim. We'll see how that works. So the reason why I checked the spacing from the rim to the tire, I'm doing a little preliminary, the tire to the fender. I'm doing a little preliminary work on, it looks like that hub and bearing assembly would be better off if I shimmed it about 1/8 of an inch out further than it is right now, and that would actually allow the caliper bracket to fall in the correct position for the caliper to be centered in the rotor. I'll show you that in a minute. Alright, so what I've done is I've made up this little spacer to go on here, and what that'll do is space this inner wheel bearing out a little bit, and hopefully that'll allow the caliper bracket to fit where it belongs in relationship to the rotor in its new position. Well folks, I'm pretty excited. Not only was I able to figure out with an adapter, actually a bushing, to go between the factory Mazda spindle to the Ford Crown Victoria hub. I'm using the Ford Crown Victoria rotor, and look, I've got the Ford Explorer dual piston caliper on there, and believe it or not, one of the bolts actually bolts to the stock Mazda spindle bracket for the caliper. So I've got to modify one hole on the caliper bracket, and the caliper bracket will stay on there. It'll be nice and strong. I'm very excited. I was able to maintain the correct distance. You can see how I'm checking this from the flange. I've been measuring off of something constant so we can see the distance of from the flange of the new rotor to the fender, and then I've able to maintain a reasonable similarity with the stock Mazda rotor, so I know I won't be pushing the tire out. As a matter of fact, it's going to be tucked in just a tiny bit. I know sometimes when we adapt spindles from one car to another, we end up pushing the tire out of the fender well. That's not going to be the case here. I'm pretty excited. the whole point of going through this exercise was to match the 5-on 4.5 bolt pattern with the 8.8 rear, so I can have the same rims all the way around. I only have to carry one spare at that point. And man, the fact that I might be able to get the power of these dual piston calipers on this nice heavy duty rotor. I know the police cars, they make the power stop rotors with the slotted vented things, so I'll be able to keep them cool. So man, it's worth spending the day in the junkyard grabbing some of these parts. And I'm so glad that I found a complete Ford Explorer and found these dual piston calipers, because the caliper bracket is going to work perfect. So I'm really excited about that. Not spending a tremendous amount of money. It's all off-the-shelf parts at AutoZone, Napa, any of those places. And you can see I just had to space the new wheel bearing hub off of the factory spindle. I don't know if I can get in there and show you, but it's right there. The spacer I made, just temporary. That's not what's going in there. It's going to be a nice billet spacer with a good shoulder on it to meet up there, but that's what got the caliper spacing, so the caliper bracket is perfectly spaced in the rotor. And we can make this happen. So I'm really relieved. I thought I was going to have to do some crazy things with the spindles on this. The Mazda has a lower ball joint that comes through from the top to the spindle, and the standard configuration for the upper. And that situation, I mean, you know, the early Corvettes and some of the other older cars had a spindle like that. To chase that around and make it all work, still use the factory steering geometry. I'm going to modify the length of these steering arms. I'm going to build my own steering arms so I get quicker and more turning radius. That's one of the ways I'm going to accomplish that. So my next goal is to find another set of these in a junkyard somewhere and fixture them up and make a billet set of these with this tie rod end moved inboard, probably an inch, and that'll give me more steering angle without running out of steering box. So might end up adding a little bit to the amount of effort in the steering wheel, but I got power steering, and I think we can make it work. So big brakes on a Mazda B2200 on the cheap. I'm psyched. Next time on KEI Fabrication, when I'm mounting it up, so it worked good. I got the leverage to break the bolt free. So the E is for engineering.